Welcome everyone to this first ever East Midlands Salon online. I'm Dennis Hayes and I'm one of the organisers of the East Midlands Salon, which meets every month in Derby. And we have a whole range of exciting topics that we discuss, but I would just like to say before we begin, 2 announcements for the future. On October the 3rd in Buxton, there's going to be the first ever Buxton Battle of Ideas Festival. So we're moving the Battle of Ideas that some of you know about for the first time out of London. There'll be a whole day in the Devonshire Dome at Buxton. So something to really put in your diaries. And the next salon here online will be discussing what is a citizen, and we'll have Vanessa Pupovac talking on the first Thursday in June. So more details about that later. But now for our salon, we've got Jo Herlihy, who's a regular at the salon and has just produced this, if I can get it up, fantastic book on Alchemy, A Search for Truth. I'm sure she'll do the promotions for it as we go along. And she's going to talk for about 20 minutes and I'll be over to you for questions. So I'll unmute you, Jo, and you can begin.
Thank you, Dennis. Can I just say, Dennis, Vanessa's just texted me to say she can't get in. So I don't know whether you've got an email from her.
I did.
Okay, right. Yes, welcome everybody and thank you for joining this discussion. I'll just start because we haven't got a great deal of time and I've got quite a lot I want to get through. My book is a product of research where I looked at alchemy in its broadest terms, and the main aim was to provide a text that provided the specific context for the different eras that alchemists worked in. So in the discussion this evening, obviously I had to think about what would be most helpful for a discussion, given the broad amount of things that I cover and over such a long time period. So I want to present to you 4 things from the work that I've done. The first is just to explain a bit more what the underlying motivations were for why I wrote the book. And then I want to provide you with a definition of alchemy that I used while working on the book, just so that we've got a common understanding for our discussion. Other people might have differences of opinion on that definition. And then thirdly, and most of the discussion, I want to present to you 3 historical themes that presented themselves to me whilst I was studying the book, and use examples of specific alchemists that show how these different themes were played out. Obviously these overlap, but I hope they help to tell a story. And as well as the themes, I hope through the collection of examples I'm able to convey to you the richness of the ideas that alchemy operates within. And finally, just a few of my own reflections from having done this research. So why explore alchemy? The first one is I think it's a way to understand better the thinking in the pre-scientific age, in its richness of philosophy, of religion, and the activity of observation and experimentation. But it's important to try to understand alchemists in their own terms and what they thought they were doing, as it wasn't activity without purpose and method. And the book takes us up to the 1700s when the golden age of alchemy effectively comes to a close. Helping me in my first stage of doing this research, I followed the podcast series, The History of Alchemy, that provides accounts of lots of the colourful characters in alchemy. And Travis, who created this podcast, is with us this evening. So hopefully, if you have specific questions I can't answer on alchemists, Travis will be more than able to fill in some of the detail. Coupled with this, I was inspired by one of the weekend conferences organised by the Academy of Ideas that raised questions around how to understand the relationship between the concepts of reason and mystery, rationality and irrationality, heresy and orthodoxy, in relation to notions of truth and the limits of knowledge. And I felt that alchemy sat between these concepts and therefore provides quite useful insights into how these tensions work themselves through. And third, my hope was that by understanding the relationship between the experimental and the creative activities of people to ideas in the past, I might gain some different perspectives that could help inform our own contemporary understanding about the limits of knowledge, science, and other relevant ideas. So, cantering through a quick definition of alchemy. The ancient art of alchemy has been practiced down the ages, playing into different historical themes. Alchemy has sometimes been shunned and repelled, and sometimes it's been embraced by emperors to caliphs, royal courts to city-state rulers, merchants and traders. Unsurprisingly, however, any reading around the topic shows that alchemy has not been one continuous single practice. It's evolved in different ways, combining many different practices and belief systems, and it's been regarded very differently in different eras. One useful description of alchemy is that's provided that I think is quite a helpful way of thinking about the breadth of what alchemy is, was by Adam McLean, and who's dedicated to exploring and gathering all things alchemy. And he describes it as a multifaceted subject. It is an early form of chemical technology, exploring the nature of substances. It is also a philosophy of the cosmos and of mankind's place in the scheme of things. Alchemy developed an amazing language of emblematic symbolism, which it used to explore the world. It had a strong philosophical basis, and many alchemists incorporated religious metaphor and spiritual matters into their alchemical ideas. That's quite a comprehensive overview of just how broad alchemy is. And we generally use the term to describe the practice that emerged around the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. It centered around Hellenistic Alexandria and Roman-ruled Egypt. And alchemy has a dual nature: one, its practical experimental side, the side that's associated with transmutation. This is derived from existing craft technique for working with metals that emerged from the Near East Bronze and Iron Ages. And we mainly think of alchemy as an endeavour to find out how to turn base metals, such as lead, into those that don't corrode, like gold and silver, the noble metals, through a process called chrysophia, which is the transmutation. But also other trades have been associated with alchemy, i.e. those involved in the production or replication of expensive dyes, precious gemstones, and medicines using herbs. And the secrecy of alchemy partly comes from these early days of protecting trade secrets. Then there's the spiritual side of the practice, bound up with transcendence. Influences are taken from ancient Egyptian mystery religions, drawing on various ancient texts, often not as old as claimed. Metic texts, for example, were thought to have been authored by an ancient sage, Hermes Trismegistus, going back to the time of Moses. But the spiritual and priestly side of alchemy is another way it has been associated with secrecy and esoteric mystical practices. Indicating its diverse history, knowledge it encompassed, the world of alchemy comes from the Eastern Arabic alchemical tradition starting in the 7th century. But its term is the one we now use from the start of the practice. So that was just a quick canter through some basic definitions of alchemy. And then in this section, I've organised examples of alchemists around 3 historical themes: how alchemy fits into wealth creation, how knowledge of alchemy and its use fitted within wider projects of power and authority, and alchemy in relation to the supposed limits of knowledge. Given the book covers 1400 years, I'm hoping this helps at least to frame a potentially very wide-ranging discussion. So, in the first theme then, here's alchemy and its role in wealth creation. In these 2 examples I use in this section, there was a strong belief in both those in authority that ancient secrets existed for how to produce gold. One example is from when alchemy begins as a practice, the other towards the end of alchemy's golden age. Our first example is from Alexandria in Egypt in the 3rd century AD. It's Alexandria being a Greco-Egyptian city during Roman rule, and this city remained a key centre for the development of alchemy centuries. Alexandria had been known for its enormous library museum and for being one of the most important places of learning in the ancient world, and was a major centre of scholarship where many Romans came to study, and the Greek philosophical school of Alexandria continued here until the 600s. A wide variety of beliefs coexisted at this point, drawing on influences from Western Greek philosophy and from Eastern religions and beliefs popular with Romans, such as those coming from the Mesopotamian Chaldean astrologers. Significantly, too, this was a time also of Plotinus. He synthesized concepts from Plato, Aristotle, and Christian Gnosticism, developing ideas around the divinity and the one. His work later became known as Neoplatonism and was hugely significant in the evolution of philosophy and theology. But this was a very difficult time for the Roman Empire. It had reached its zenith and was facing a multitude of pressures. And it is in this time that we find in Alexandria, Zosimos of Panopolis, who lived during this time. And he wrote the oldest and one of the only surviving early alchemical texts. He was influenced by theoretical speculations of Greek pre-Socratics, and he used artisanal methods of experimentation. He believed his transformers of transmutation would turn lead into silver, copper, and gold. And this was simultaneously a search for oneness with an external divine God, the idea of divinity becoming an increasingly strong current in thought. A quote from him illustrates this transformative process, and, as it happens, also is draw on the ages of man described by Greek writer Hesiod. The priest, this man of copper, he has changed the colour of his nature and has become a man of silver. If thou wishest, thou wilt soon have him a man of gold. But the problem for the Romans was the possibility that this ancient knowledge was actually true, and that the alchemists could turn metals into gold. And in this context, alchemy was perceived to be a major threat in terms of wealth generation. The possibility was that the Roman currency would be devalued, exacerbating existing problems within the empire, and this proved too much for Emperor Diocletian. He moved against the alchemists around 297, when he attempted to destroy alchemy's literary heritage, reportedly ordering all books written by the Egyptians on chemia of silver and gold to be burned. So there you have a situation rich in knowledge and study, where belief in alchemy was very strong, to the point where alchemists and their work was banned. And then on the other hand, you now fast forward to Prague, some 1200 years later, where we find that belief in alchemy still remains incredibly strong. This is the golden age of alchemy, shaped by the Renaissance revival of ancient texts, including the Hermetic texts of alchemy. Rather than stop gold production, the royal courts wanted to harness the power of alchemy to, amongst other things, fund their extensive state actions. At a time when people in other parts of Europe found it dangerous to be dabbling in potentially heretical and religious practice and could face grave consequences, Rudolf II attracted to his court in Prague astronomers, mathematicians, and alchemists, including the influential John Dee, who advised Elizabeth I, and his associate Kelly, as well as Tycho Brahe and Johann Kepler, providing them with laboratories and allowing them to experiment. Rudolf, like others, kept people prisoner in order to extract their alchemical secrets. Alchemist Alexander Seton and Polishman Michael Sendvigovius appear to have worked together using Seton's powder to create gold. Rudolf died in 1612, 9 months after he had been stripped of all effective power by his younger brother. Sendvigovius, on the other hand, became a rich man, making much of his money through his work on designing Polish mines and foundries. And in terms of how this alchemical practice worked out, it's quite useful. There's a very good video on YouTube you can find by William R. Newman, and he works through some of the alchemical experiments and shows something very similar to the experiments of Seton and Sendvigovius on plating, which turns out to have sort of strong basis in science today. So obviously these people were experimenting and trying things that we think were magical, but actually turned out to have foundations in truth. The next set of examples is around how alchemy operated as an instrument of power. In the following example, the wider context helps I'm just checking the time, helps illustrate that alchemists weren't just working in isolation, but played their part in wider projects. Firstly, serving a wider project that involved the extension of power and influence by higher powers. But also, this process inevitably created rich and challenging debates within those societies that were not entirely in control of powers that be. And a very good example of this is within the new Arabic Empire. This empire spread rapidly from the mid-650s as the Eastern and Western Roman empires and the Persian Empire declined or struggled. Part of the challenge of the new empire was the consolidation of its rule over vast swathes of land, and people of these advanced and control people of these advanced and developed empires. So for the Arabs, acquiring knowledge and then making it their own became a major feature of the early centuries of this new empire. It drew on many Persian, Christian and Greek philosophical influences, including Greek philosophers who had moved for protection under the Persians following the closure of the Platonic schools in Athens. And one of the Arabs, Khalid ibn Yazid, a prince and collector of books, provided a link between the Alexandrian schools of alchemy and subsequent Arabian schools. But ideas are also manufactured by the Arabs themselves. It is around this time that a key alchemical text, the Emerald Tablet, is authored, layering Greek and Egyptian myths and ideas. And one of the key expressions that's now associated and paraphrased with an alchemy, which is as above, so below, which has all sorts of different layers within it that are relevant, both in terms of thinking about metaphysical systems, but also the substances used within alchemy. From the mid-700s, the Arabic Empire was ruled by the Abbasids from Baghdad, a circular city that it turns out was inspired by Alexandrian Greek mathematician Euclid. And this was the golden age of the Arabic Empire, extending into the future for many centuries. At the start of this the Islamic Golden Age was a translation movement that lasted a couple of hundred years. And it started under the direction of Al-Kindi, and the House of Wisdom, which was an archival store, was set up. And this helped create the highly creative and productive development of alchemia, which is chemistry, and many other disciplines taken forward by the Arabs at this time. In terms of philosophy, again, and looking at the richness that alchemy was informed by, it's important at this stage that early translations including Aristotle's Physics and the Topics and works by Plotinus, which was greatly influenced by Plato's Timaeus, his metaphysical account of the cosmos, were highly influential works right up until the medieval period, and they were carried forward by the Arabs during this period of Arab translation. And it's here in Baghdad that we find our first Arab alchemist, Al-Razi. When we say he was an alchemist, he was also a great rationalist, physician and polymath, authoring one of the most comprehensive books on medicine influential through to the 1600s. In addition, he wrote a significant work, the Book of Secrets, systematically detailing the many experimental processes he had undertaken and providing an inventory of substances and apparatus and recipes for products that led to transmutations of some kind. He was a fiercely independent thinker, developing his own view on what was the truth, which included debate with Al-Kindi on the reality of Chrysophia, him defending it to the extent that he believed the study of philosophy could not be considered complete, and a learned man could not be called a philosopher until he had succeeded in producing the alchemical transmutation. Clearly, he believed alchemy was potentially within his grasp. But as we find repeated at different times, this wealth of knowledge did not always serve the powers of authority in the way they wished. His curiosity and use of empirical methods and logical speculation resulted in him making a break with methods of inquiry from archaic formulas and numerology. Significantly, this approach removed the need to understand physical processes within a unified system, connecting practical knowledge to divine will. This gave him a freedom with experimentation that paved the way of the discipline of chemistry to emerge. And that same pattern of breaking some of the principles of the coherent systems of ideas, for example, within Aristotle's four causes, he obviously begins to break from that, and means that experimentation can be conducted divorced from association with the divine will, so that you don't have to have a complete cause and effect chain. And I think that is some of the start of some of that breaking of a long, slow evolutionary process that moves towards science and chemistry. But for Al-Razi, his knowledge and experimentation were nevertheless limited within a strict orthodoxy. His work followed in the wake of a period of conflict when a theological war had been fought out between the rationalists, supported by the Caliph, and the traditionalist theocracy, and it was the conservative clerics that won the day, and the imam having a pivotal role in deciding orthodoxy. But Al-Razi challenged them, believing that every man could make his own judgment and did not need any guide teaching him what to think or do. For holding his views contrary to Islamic dogma, he was known as a Zindiq. Although Al-Razi was not imprisoned or executed because of his ideas on religion and prophecy, he was censored for his opinions, with some of his philosophical and theological works being destroyed. The last section that I was going to look at, the last example, was about alchemy and the limits of knowledge. I'm not going to talk about it, I think, in sufficient time, but I think what I wanted to convey within this section was that this was during the period of the Reformation, and the examples that I was going to look at was Paracelsus and Newton. They're not insignificant figures, and they could themselves have talks on their own. And I think the important point about these two characters, and I think the main point I wanted to convey, is they're both practitioners of alchemy. Paracelsus came from a mining town, and that whole the mining is significant in the whole evolution of alchemical thinking, because it's underground that people actually feel that in viewing metals, that this is potentially organic material, and they think that they can replicate that within a laboratory environment. And that is something that Newton believes and takes forward. But I think the important thing is, within the period of the Reformation, these people don't just work within orthodoxies, but actually begin to break outside of it. And Paracelsus is known a bit as the Luther of physics, where he goes against the main traditions of the academy, and chemistry is a sort of rogue discipline at this point. It doesn't have the status of an academic discipline, and it's something that people practice not bedside as the physician might, but out practicing, not theoretically, but out experimenting. And so he tears up and burns literally some of the old classics, and breaks some of the old academic systems of thought. And for Newton, again, not insignificantly, he spent 30 years studying alchemy in private, in secret, because he was unlike the trend towards mechanistic scientific thinking. He was convinced much more of the sort of vitalist aspect of God in nature, and he couldn't abide, I think, the idea of this mechanistic world that was being moved into, and alchemy, I think, drove some of that practice. So there isn't really time to go into that. So I think really the question of so what in studying alchemy, because it's very interesting, and obviously I'm very animated by it, and it's very rich in wonderful stories, and it's very interesting from the point of view of how philosophy, theology, excuse me, and science all interrelate. But one of the things I think is that you can see that alchemy does come to a natural death, if you like. It comes to a death of natural causes. It sort of spends itself out. You have the emergence of the scientific method, where the demands and standard of rigorous method of proof and repeatability could not be sustained in many alchemical processes. the Aristotelian metaphysical system that had so influenced the Catholic Church was utterly shattered through astronomy and the new developments in physics. And the production of gold from base metals appeared groundless. And despite all of this, underlying the scientific method and the Enlightenment, nevertheless, was still driven by assumptions of progress that retained a strong human-centered philosophy, if not a directly religious one. So, I think even though the alchemy finished as a practice, what I found very strongly while doing the research for this book is that even over the course of 1400 years, in different forms, you did have that sense that there was an underlying sense of a human-centered project that was happening, and divinity and its relationship to that project happened in greater or lesser extent, but there was over that whole period of time a context within which alchemy worked. And importantly, even though someone like Bacon, Francis Bacon, developed the idea of the early scientific method, stretching out and breaking that Aristotelian system of causes, what you do have is that his driving behind all of that was the idea that humans would have dominion over the earth for the benefit of for goodness, and bringing people back to a pre-lapsian state of goodness. And I think what we'd have to say now from reflection is that even if you don't have a religious project, what you can say is the idea of any real driving force that man should have dominion over the earth seems today rather closer to hell for many people than it does to trying to retrieve a pre-lapsian state. And there is no sense of any final cause, not that there should be a final cause, but there is no sense around which and how you would construct a sense of goodness, and one that's man-made. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that science should become in any way just purely instrumental. But what we have seen is that much knowledge does come from challenging limits, and that where you might have what you would replace religion with is that sense, and I think that comes through alchemists, is that sense of imagination, and where they might have thought of religion, they might have thought of as God. Obviously, from our point of view, we can replace that with the idea of imagination. So I think just in terms of reflection, that is one of the things that I suppose one of the things that I was has come to the forefront for me is that lack of any real sense of guiding principle around how you take forward a project. But I think there's towards the end of the book, I think what is a very nice way that I think for me the book comes to a conclusion is that you find that through that project of the balance of trying to struggle between finding certainty, at certain points you do have a crystallization of knowledge, and that finds real concrete form, which I've described through the different chapter names. But that there's right at the end, you find that Hannah Arendt beautifully captures the fact that whilst we want to make concrete our purpose, at the same time, man's imagination will always break free from that and will always peel off and try to do something that breaks the boundaries of orthodoxy.
Thank you, Jo. It's really interesting. One of the most exciting things about your book, I think, is how alchemy always pushes at the limits of existing knowledge. And you know, it's, well, as you just mentioned, towards the end, it's a fantastic inspirational book that says this is what we can learn from alchemy. Those of you who thought we would transform gold into toilet rolls, it's not going to happen. So any questions, please? First of all, if you put your hands up and work out how to do the function, I'll take you as the hands come up. No one? Ah, Chris, I'll unmute you. Chris?
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Brilliant. Yeah, really, really interesting. I'm not necessarily fast forwarding a little bit. I'm interested. I mean, as you were talking, and as alchemy kind of figures in my head, I think of things like Macbeth, and potentially the association there with attempting to intervene magically or intervene through witchcraft on the world, and obviously how that's picked up by Shakespeare. And I was just wondering, really, two things: how is that idea of alchemy played with by Shakespeare, and second, is he tapping into a broader kind of cultural exposure to alchemy, or has alchemy kind of been and gone by that point? Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Daniel, I've unmuted you, I think. Where's Daniel?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that was really interesting. I've just got a question on Francis Bacon, because Jo, you mentioned him as the one of the founders of the scientific method, but I just wasn't clear on his attitude to alchemy. If he was hostile, if he was partly in favour of it, just where did he stand on that question?
Thanks, Daniel. Richard?
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. I must say, I'm not at all convinced by the idea that that there is a dichotomy between alchemy and science. It just seems to me that in fact, the very definition of alchemy you gave didn't exclude anything. Alchemy was the pursuit of knowledge to court, really, and because one lives in a world governed by deities of various sorts, certainly in Christian Europe, you would expect the world to be orderly, for there to be foundations to knowledge which are subject to exploration. And it seems to me that when you have got certainly that when you have the Elizabethan period and later, one sees great alchemists such as John Dee and so on, who are practicing mathematicians and doctors and so on. I don't think I'm not sure that these characters, even Robert Boyle later, with his skeptical chemist, see that they're doing something different other than advancing knowledge. It's just that some bits of knowledge that have been accepted historically don't work anymore, and one moves on. So it just seems to me, rather than thinking alchemy's turned into spiritualism, as it were, it just seems to me alchemy's just turned into the mainstream sciences.
Thanks, Richard. Sean, and then Alistair, and then back to Jo. So Sean, I'll unmute you. Sean?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I didn't realise I had to press something. Yeah. I was just picking up on Chris's point about Shakespeare. Actually, it just strikes me that alchemy, from our point of view, looks a bit like kind of magic, but I think there is like a difference between that and witchcraft, which is quite interesting. But it seems to me it might be kind of something that's almost kind of class driven, whereas the kind of figure of the alchemist is sort of like an upper class figure, really, as people like John Dee, I suppose, who have expensive equipment and rare sourced ores and metals or whatever, whereas kind of witches are kind of toe of dog and eye of newt, or all of that kind of thing, So I don't know. I just wonder if, like, the kind of difference between the kind of lineage of alchemy and witchcraft, the reason why they're seen so differently, like different forms of knowledge, there's a sort of social, there's a sort of class-based element to that. I don't know what you think of that idea.
Thanks, Sean. Alistair, and then back to Jo. I'll get everybody else later, but Alistair first.
Yeah, thanks, Jo. That was really fascinating. I suppose my question follows on, and it's probably a little bit of a simplistic question, to be honest, but it probably follows on from the last two, because you covered such a huge range of different ages and also such a huge range of different, there's knowledge, there's production, there's magic, there's philosophy, there's all these things that are thrown in there. So I find it difficult to get my head around kind of, I suppose, not only how it all hangs together, but I suppose essentially what is the essence of alchemy, given that all of these things. I mean, is it that it's a human-centered project, like you mentioned towards the end there? I mean, is that what kind of hangs it all together, as it were, or is there something different, or is that just a stupid question?
Thanks, Alistair. No such thing as stupid questions. Jo, do you want to?
Okay. There is a little section. This is on the question on Macbeth. There is a little section in the book where I look at the whole thing about theatre, and I think the important thing about Macbeth is that he's playing really to James, who was, I think, between who sort of straddled two eras, if you like, in the sense that he came from the very sort of superstitious Scotland, and himself thought that he'd been cursed by witches, but came to England, which was a sort of more advanced sort of parliament and more sort of enlightened, if you like. But I think it was at that end of that period of the 1500s of, in many places, a sort of breakdown of order in a lot of places, in terms of things like some of the witch trials that happened, is that you have it's tapping into a fear of the loss of control of belief, and I think that's where you have a sort of, and that's why I think that what I was trying to explore is the relationship between people who are rationalists and great eminent thinkers being simultaneously happy to see the chasing down of witches. And I think that was one of the things that I was trying to explore, is how can you have people apparently really rational on the one hand, yet on the other hand appear to be happy to play to these ideas of sort of heresy and hysteria, hysteria. And I think it is because that period of the 1500s moving into the 1600s is that you do have that breakdown through the Reformation of that sense of control by the church and by the major powers, and you have a transition of power more towards the temporal powers away from the church. And it does mean that Macbeth, in one sense, is a book that explores that sense of panic, really, and fear that was quite pervasive, and infects Europe towards the end of the 1500s. And I think it also is played out in the whole Faust plays. And Faust, as a play, goes through a series of transitions from when it's originally written through a number of different incarnations as the sort of climate changes. And I think it's not just Macbeth, but I think also The Tempest. The Prospero character is apparently what's the word? Built around the character of John Dee. So there is that relation, in very clear sense that there is a direct that Shakespeare's playing out through some of these characters, some of the ideas of the time. And he does definitely tap into alchemy. And the character of Prospero, I think, is where that he uses forces for good, but only on a temporary basis, where some of the more dark powers, the control of the control of power is used for evil in a very different way, and not for good. So there's definitely links there. And I think on Francis Bacon, Daniel, it just escapes me. I can't remember what his position is, which is ridiculous. I think he's very much, I can't remember. I'm going to look it up and I'll come back to you, which is a bit ridiculous because I spent a lot of time looking at Francis Bacon, but I just can't recall what his specific attitude on alchemy was. And I think the thing about it not being a dichotomy that Richard raised, I think it's true. I think it's just that I think the important thing for me with Francis Bacon and where he comes in is simply the point that you're starting to rely on a much more systematic set of standards of proof and repeatability. And with alchemy, obviously, up until that hasn't happened. A lot of this is done in secret. People keep their experimental processes secret, and I think that's what you can see through what Rudolf does with some of these people, and I think the King of Poland as well, is they bring people and keep them imprisoned in their castles, and because they want to force their their alchemical secrets out of them. So these things aren't made public. And I think on that basis, you can't have methods of proof and testability. But what you find repeated time and time again, and I think Travis would also no doubt have some very good examples, is that you have a situation what appears in the debate to be someone pursuing something really irrational, like Isaac Newton, sitting in his lab for 30 years doing something that to us seems impossible. And it turns out that some of his experiments turn out to be impossible. But it's because he's driving for something that he doesn't feel is explained sufficiently by the other arguments of the mechanistic Descartes, for example, that he continues to pursue this because he cannot give up on what he believes to be his instinct for something else. And I think that in that sense, you could say that's what we want to hold on to. And that's the thing that I think is really nice that comes through it, is that people are always within their own period pushing the boundaries of knowledge and acceptable ideas until it breaks. And then you obviously have, different eras. But I don't know if that sufficiently addresses what you were saying, Richard. And on the class-driven stuff, Sean, I think there is definitely a class element that plays itself out, but I think you'd have to unpick it, and probably something we haven't got time for to explore, is that witchcraft, I think, is derived from, and the hostility towards local pagan practice, the sort of methods of herbalism and some of these things that happen, and the hostility towards it arises from quite different places to the attitudes towards alchemy. And I do think you have sort of low arts and high arts. And I think there is a whole movement that is very sort of much around, it's a very important development that happens around the time of when all of these intellectual movements are developing, where our salons come from, those intellectual movements where there is a sense that, and it's there's these sort of underground secret societies where they want to proliferate their alchemical ideas, because I do think there's a sort of a very strange idea that the ideas that some of the upper classes have need to be spread throughout society, but they need to control it. So there is a form of elitism that goes on. But also you have to be a little bit careful with some of that, because also we're living at a time of heightened religious anxiety. And so some of the ideas within some of the intellectual classes and the people who have money and time, I suppose, to do some of these experiments, like the wealthy Boyles and other people like that, is that there is most of it shrouded in secrecy. And the work of Boyle passes secretly between him and John Locke, and Newton manages to prize this information out of John Locke. So I think all of that secrecy is tied up with class, but I think it's also, some of it is elitism, but I think some of it is to do with the ongoing constraints of religion at the time.
Okay, thanks, Jo. I noticed that Jonathan had his hand up. I don't know if Jonathan or anyone else now comments, contributions. Jonathan, put your hand up.
Yes, sorry, I was a bit late with the reaction. I wanted to raise a historiographical point that the scientific revolution tends to, the people during the period we call the scientific revolution, tends to talk about their predecessors in very derogatory terms. And yet when you look closely at what they've actually written and what they're doing, very often it doesn't stand up. For example, beneath the diagram in De Revolutionibus, where Copernicus shows the sun as the center of the universe, as he thinks, he puts, Trismegistus says the sun is the visible God. There's a justification for it. So he's actually quoting, you know, the most influential person who never existed, Hermes Trismegistus, to justify this revolutionary idea. And as for Newton, I think one of the great ironies about Newton is that right up and from the period of the publication of the Principia and the Optics, right through to the 20th century, he was regarded as the epitome of the mechanistic philosophy. Mm-hmm. But when you read him carefully, you see there's all sorts of little hints that he's thinking alchemically. And there's that wonderful thing, I mean, you, Jo, will know this. I was just looking here, when John Maynard Keynes discovered that Newton's alchemical papers were about to be auctioned, tried to buy them, and looked in the box and was astonished by what he found. And he said Newton was not the first of the age of reason, he was the last of the magicians. He was the last of those who looked out on the visible world with the same sense that our ancestors had done. Now, one of the problems of the mechanical philosophy is, and you tend to think that's what Newton succeeded in establishing, even though he thought he'd refuted it, because his theory of gravitation, if you read what he says about it, it's anti-mechanical. Everybody sort of just leapt on it and said, we've changed the notion of mechanism to allow action at a distance, so we can swallow it and still pretend we are keeping a mechanical view of the world. But the thing is that the mechanistic philosophy imposes what Whitehead called a bifurcation of nature into mechanism and consciousness. And this does not make sense. And it seems to me that what the alchemists are actually struggling with is a problem we still have, which how it's to make sense of the fact that the matter that makes up all of those things around us is something which in us can actually become conscious of the fact that it's there. The mechanical philosophy does not explain that. It drives a wedge and says, with Descartes, there's mind and there's matter. But the alchemists, from that point of view, may be trying to touch on a problem that we still don't yet know how to ask, let alone how to answer.
Thanks, Jonathan. Very interesting. Vanessa?
Yeah, it was just, I suppose, a comment on Bacon, because I really liked, again, the sort of representations of that age and figures like Bacon, because often Bacon is just represented as wanting to torture nature's secrets, but when you read his work, I mean, it's quite, it's there's aspects that are very progressive. It says, if rulers want to avoid rebellion and sedition, that they should provide for all their material wants. I think in terms of Bacon, I mean, he does raise criticisms of alchemy, but I think it's in the same spirit that he raises criticisms. You know, he attacks scholasticism. So it's not that he would attack alchemist experiments. He would attack the reliance on all those older frameworks. And I suppose the other thing, just to highlight in terms of Richard's point about that there isn't a clear dichotomy. I think that's right, because if we look at this is a discussion that Koestler's The Sleepwalkers explores, where, you know, all that funding for those telescopes was all during the 30 Years' War, where you've got all these princes really nervous about what their destiny is, and they were employing all these people to look at the star. All that stargazing was to find out their fate, to look at all the portents, and this was taken really seriously. So that you've got sort of the major banks, the sort of key banks of the time also stargazing and reporting any sightings of particular signs in nature and so on. So you do have this really interesting the pursuit of science goes along with all the anxieties of the time, and there isn't this clear divide between the old alchemy and the new science yet, and the acceptance of the primary divine cause goes along with an acceptance of secondary causes in humanity. So the two go together. The pursuit of knowledge goes together.
Thanks, Vanessa. Anyone else? One more before I bring Jo in again. No hands up.
Drew.
Oh, hello, Drew. I'll unmute you. There you go.
Right. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go.
Just to say, listening to all of this, what I did quite a lot of whatever it's called, subbing or proofreading or something on Jo's book, and it, as a complete layman, and certainly no intellectual, it just struck me as it's a broad introduction to something that I've never even considered before. So roll forward several months. It was my birthday last week, and Jo bought me a book called I Is Another by James Geary, which you might know of or not, which is basically a book about the notion of metaphor. And now, just today, this morning, I've started to read it finally. My birthday was last week. It's taken me a week to get into it, or to open it. And I kept, while I was reading the first 20, 30 pages, I kept going back to the proofing that I'd done for Jo's book as a metaphor. And it struck me as really interesting because it's alchemy. And I'm sure that I must have thought that while I was actually proofing it, and I'm sure Jo might or might not remember. I probably, she bought me the book for a reason. I sort of, metaphors, or I see them bloody everywhere. So all I'm trying to say is that's outside of the sort of everybody's knowledge, an outsider, a layman like myself, I found it quite, basically I found the whole of her book as an extended, the whole idea of alchemy as an extended metaphor for everything that we do. I mean, I know that's really simplistic, and it goes back to the I think it was Alistair brought in the class thing earlier, and of course my ears prick up because I'm, you know, always conscious of that. And it sort of struck me, it doesn't necessarily, alchemy doesn't have to be seen just in this intellectualized way. It can be seen as a metaphor for what we do with our lives, for however the choices that we make and how we da 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 da. Do you understand what that's all I'm trying to say? That's a very convoluted way of saying something that is quite simple, I think. I've probably not done a terribly good job of it, but I just thought I'd throw it in as something. Jo's book sort of, it sounds like I'm promoting Jo's book now, that's not what I mean to do, but the idea works on many, many levels. So if it was Alistair, if it was somebody else, then forgive me that I've forgotten their name. It's, as ever, because I'm me, there's always a consciousness of a separation from within the classes of just us having this discussion. It becomes a very closed thing in one sense, but it could become something else, and that's what I'm trying to say. Is that any clearer?
Yeah, thanks. Very important. Jo, do you want to respond?
I think I missed out just responding to Alistair's question, which was just what the essence of alchemy was, and I think that sort of then relates a bit to the point that Drew's made. It's just coming back to that, because I think in one sense it's a fairly simple response, but then on the other hand it's not straightforward. So you could say, if you take Lawrence Principe, who's written a very good, he's a scientist, and he's written a very good comprehensive account of trying to trace and piece together the evolution of alchemy in scientific terms, and tried to look at where it's likely that people were doing real experiments and what were those experiments made of, and he traced it back. So it's a very, very good book. Is that he basically boils it down to the two elements, which is a sort of artisan process, which I said in my thing as well, which was the thing that you inherit from sort of metallurgy and the sort of bronze and iron eras of ages of through those processes, the experimentation that arises from that. But then he also looks at the sort of nature and matter theoretical elements. And I think the problem then is that it's very hard then to pin down alchemy in those terms, because as times move on and religious and theoretical and philosophical contexts change, where people derive their inspiration from changes. So alchemy changes, I think, over time, and where people look for their basis of knowledge, because you're not just simply talking about the artisan practice of trying to make one substance into another. There is layers of, as people understand matter, people are potentially trying to divine through the experiments something as a contemplative process that is transformative of themselves through that contemplation, or that provides secrets and insights into divine knowledge that exists outside of themselves. And I think that therefore it's very hard to pin alchemy down, because it changes as as our belief systems have evolved over time. So I think that's the only thing, and I think that therefore means that, and I think that's where Adam McLean actually uses the word metaphor in his own description that I use right at the start, is that there is a sense in which people are trying to imagine and make sense of their world through belief systems. And I think in that sense, alchemy plays a role in filling that gap between the rational and the irrational, to try to help bridge those gaps that people can't often explain. And as I think, might have been Jonathan said, is that we ourselves still find difficult to explain sometimes.
Okay, Travis, you've been waiting patiently.
Yeah, you can hear me, right? Am I muted? No. Okay. I just kind of wanted to build on the the question around, well, what is alchemy, or how could you imagine an alchemist, and especially the class question that kind of came up a couple of times, because that's one that I find highly fascinating when I'm trying to define alchemy for myself or think about the history. The one part I could not simplify is, so Jo just said alchemy, the definition of alchemy has somewhat changed in a sense over 1400 years. But then at each given time, you don't just have one archetype of an alchemist. You always have, I think this was also brought up, alchemy is not a dichotomy between logic and mysticism or whatever, because you do have these people that are very rational and have a classification system. I'm thinking of like Al-Ghazali, or especially the Arab ones were doing experiments in the open, or Persian, I should say, doing experiments in the open where everybody knew about it. It was very legal. It was very respected in a way. But often higher class, often access to books, literate, all that should be said. And then later in Europe, again, you have so Tycho Brahe, who Jo mentioned, was in Prague. He was probably one of the richest Danish noblemen. And he had his lab on an island with his astronomical tools that were 2-3 stories high. He was worth 1% of Denmark, of all the economic wealth of Denmark. So Tycho Brahe is on one end of the spectrum, and we do have emperors and popes practicing alchemy. So the very top of the class system. If you look at someone like John Dee and Edward Kelly, John Dee was a struggling, somewhat nobleman. I'm not sure exactly where he falls, but he never quite got the post he wanted. He lost his fortune a couple of times, but still upper class. Whereas Edward Kelly, I would argue, was just a charlatan, a very charismatic con man. And you see that. So you see kind of street alchemists along with street fortune tellers and everything else promising that they have the recipe for the Philosopher's Stone, and all as they need is the fortune it takes to make gold, because you have to have enough fuel to heat a furnace for 40 days. You need to have the raw materials. Often you need to seed something with silver or gold. So you can't just decide to become an alchemist. Again, if you say you have knowledge of books, then those books cost money. But then, where do we draw the line between, we say, oh, he was really the father of pharmacology and not an alchemist, or in Isaac Newton's case, he was really a physicist, and we all think he's a highly respected physicist. But of course, he was an alchemist. So, but yeah, I think that kind of it tears apart the dichotomy. But you also see that you have a spectrum everywhere. From, if you were taken seriously by a prince or pope or emperor or whatever, then there's a good chance that as an alchemist you'd be upper class and had access to books and were literate and went to school to learn Latin and all of that. But not in the case of Edward Kelly. He was very self-taught, and there's plenty of other of examples.
Okay.
Yeah, don't forget the con men.
We'll come back to you, Travis. Thank you. Anyone else want to? I've got no hands up. Jonathan, again. Okay. Jonathan, you could tell us about your book as well.
Oh,
a bit of promotion.
I just wanted to comment on Jo's last comment that sometimes we struggle with this problem that they had. I wasn't arguing that. I was saying we really do. We don't have any answer to that question about matter and consciousness. And that's a problem they bequeathed. It's not that we sometimes have difficulty answering it properly. I don't think we even get started. Oh, my little thing was a copy for Jo. Have you had it? I posted it to Dennis when I went into personal lockdown at the beginning of March.
Jo's unmuted, yes.
Related to the Joseph Wright painting, the one that he never managed to sell. It was still with him when he died. And I got intrigued by the fact that there are little changes that were made to the clock and to the alchemical manuscript. And if you want to read that, there's a footnote for Jo's book.
Thank you, Jonathan. Anyone else? Richard?
Yes, thank you, Dennis. Just on Jonathan's point, I'm surprised, Jonathan, you say that no answer has been given to the question of mind and material. I mean, it was written in the Tractatus, was it not? Whereof we cannot speak, thereof we must be silent.
Okay. Sean?
I'm online. Yeah, you can hear me.
Yeah.
So, just on that interesting point, that Jonathan has made about, the point where science becomes kind of the science of the material world, as opposed to the kind of the kind of dualistic tendency. I wondered if there always seems to be like a parallel with humoral pathology, which is a kind of proto-science, I suppose, in the way that alchemy is. And since alchemy isn't really like a single tradition of things, it's a kind of bundle of traditions. I wonder if there's a case to be made for looking at humoral pathology as a kind of almost a branch of alchemy. Too much, or what do you think?
Thanks. Vanessa?
Yeah, I mean, I've partly said it on the chat, but I wanted Jo to say a little bit more about your chapter titles, because I just found your visual imagery, so sort of following up from Drew's point about metaphor and image, I was really fascinated and around your use of different images, those different spatial images of the city of the mind. I'm just looking at it now. The city of the mind, the Universal Library, the Temple of Liberty, the City of Woe to the House of Joy, the Cabinet of Curiosities. And I wonder if you could just comment something about those images and what they represented in terms of, for you, for the particular pursuit of knowledge of that age. What did they mean to you?
That's a really good question, Jo.
Okay. I think what happened was that I didn't have a plan when I started writing the book. And all I was trying to do, and this was where I had this conversation with Travis, is I was just going to try and contextualize provide some context around the 50 or 60 or 70 different outlets that Travis describes throughout his podcast series. And I think I was just trying to work out what made up those common eras. How would you break down those eras? Where would you put the partitions? So once it started to evolve into a book, it was a bit like saying, well, how do these different alchemists group together? So it was a bit of serendipity, really. And I think that when it came to what I was trying to do was initially myself and the discussion I had with Travis is that it was tracing where the source of alchemical knowledge came from. So it was almost, I was tracing where the different texts went, where the manuscripts went. And it was a bit like, I imagine it a little bit like a traveling circus, is that you've got this, big top, and it starts off in Alexandria, and then it goes over to Syria, and then it goes down into Damascus, and then it goes to Baghdad. It's that sort of thing. And I think that by understanding where and how people regarded knowledge, and alchemical knowledge was part of that store, a picture began to emerge in terms of where the main cities were of scholarship. And surprise, surprise, that's where the alchemists are. So So it was tracing that, and I think that then it was just pure chance that while I was reading around where the first public library was in Rome, that turned out that it was called the Temple of Liberty. And then it just so happened I was researching something else, and you've got the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. And then I went back, and then somebody wrote this thing and they called Alexandria the City of the Mind. And I was thinking, oh, this is really peculiar. So it's more the case it wasn't designed. It was as I was starting to write the chapters and understand the knowledge, what you realized was that it was the way that people regarded knowledge as something that was almost sacralized, that it had a certain divine element to it. It was precious. It was so important. It was, it sort of ended up in the equivalent of temples. So, or cities were the equivalent of sort of centers of scholarship and knowledge. And I think that was the other thing that just struck me, was how important knowledge was as a thing, if you like. It lived and breathed in manuscripts, and it was transported, and people traveled from one place to another because they thought that represented civilization. And if they could own it, and if they could digest it and absorb it, they too would become civilized and own this knowledge. So I think for me, it was a bit of a travelogue. And in that, you sort of ended up working out this pattern. I mean, it's not exact, because what happens is the chapters end up being a bit of a mixture of real physical spaces, of temples, with utopian ideas. And I think that's the other thing. And I got a bit mixed up and I wasn't quite sure how to resolve it. And that's why the book was a work in progress. Is that what you have is that people live in cities, but they're imperfect cities, and they want to create perfect worlds. And that's where you have the utopian ideas. So you have Magnesia and New Atlantis, and you have that whole sort of thing about if you don't have cities represent the civilization that you want, then you imagine one. But I suppose, that's a whole nother book, really. And so I just thought, well, I'll do as chapter titles, and maybe something will come of it at another time. But again, I think it just tied into the fact that alchemists and their position within reality and the imagined world, again, was a useful metaphor, because I'm not a scientist, and I'm really not very good at science, but just trying to think logically about Jonathan's point is, haven't we conceptually resolved the problem of matter and consciousness? The problem is the world can't deal with it. Haven't we resolved it in the sense that there's a natural world that we live within? We're conscious beings, but because we don't believe in God, we can't find a way to systematically work out what we do in this universe that we live in. And so our imagination potentially takes us there, but we haven't got a way, because we don't have religion, we don't have a way of making our consciousness work, because there is a separation between consciousness and the material world. The problem is we can't find enough together as humans that works out a common project to work out how we move forward. And I think that's what Kennan does in his book On a Search for a Moral Compass, is that he describes the problem as that our collective institutions are broken down, for example, so we don't have a way to mediate that discussion. That could be a million miles off what you're saying, Jonathan, but I'm just wondering whether we know the problem, we just can't resolve it.
Okay, thanks, Jo. Ruth?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
I'm still thinking about, I think Richard asked the question, what is today's alchemy? And as you were talking just now, Jo, I was thinking whether it's just knowledge rather than specifically about finding copper or how to turn cheap metal into silver or something. Maybe today's alchemy is actually knowledge.
Thanks, Ruth. Alistair?
That was on my mind as well, because you mentioned, I think you got to Hannah Arendt in your introduction and kind of left it there. So, I mean, are there any people that strike you as kind of working in that tradition? I mean, is, I don't know, Elon Musk or something going off and exploring space, or I don't know, these guys that are fascinated by Bitcoin and that's got a kind of experimental edge and a sort of mineral basis. So, I mean, is there anything that you could put within that tradition today?
So, any more questions? Chris? Go.
Yeah, it's interesting. It just struck me with a lot of the contributions that really we're asking ourselves in a way, how do we tell the history of science? And I suppose that there are at least two conflicting approaches here. One is to tell this very, Richard alluded to it earlier, this very progressivist kind of almost Whiggish history of science, and say, well, we're just marching onwards to this state of progress where we're getting further and further towards some kind of accuracy in scientific truth. And then on the other hand, there's this much more contextualized story that looks at steps along the way that might be empirically untrue, as we've said alchemy is, but nonetheless are instructive because of their historical location and because of what they did and didn't teach us, I suppose, limits of knowledge, like you alluded to earlier, Jo. And I'm just interested in what you think about that kind of methodological debate almost in the history of science. Should we be going down this very, very kind of rigid progressivist story about accuracy and exclude anything that therefore doesn't fit and call it kind of pseudoscience or call it or sort of throw it out? Or should we be inclusive of that and therefore see what we can learn from it?
Thanks, Chris. Alan?
Right. Am I there?
Yes, you're there.
Good. I have to declare that in a previous incarnation, I used to be a chemistry teacher. And so my response to the question about alchemy going forward, Jo talked about the natural death of alchemy in the 17th century. I think it's gone through two resurrections since then. Firstly, it's then turned up as chemistry, having been proto-chemistry before that, and now it's turned up again as nuclear chemistry, which is this quest to turn one element into another element through nuclear bombardment. So it seems to me the thread is still there from the foundations that alchemy laid down right through to present-day experiments on nuclear physics and nuclear chemistry. And my question really is, has anybody pursued that thread? Has anybody taken it forward into the latest developments of science itself?
Thanks, Alan. Before I bring any last questions of Jonathan, what I'm going to do is take a couple of more questions and then bring Jo in for some response. And then I'm going to do that little experiment and unmute you all. And you can either leave or stay and just try what happens with an informal discussion. I know that Richard and lots of people have got wine. So as long as it's coherent, you can keep going. No, well, we'd never get going if we did that. Okay, Jonathan.
Yeah, apologies. I didn't come along to try and... This is written in order to support the Museum and Art Gallery. I take the risk, they take the profits, yeah? And you can't buy it at the moment because they're closed. But in answer to Alan's question, the last few appendices of these is one about Newton and about what Newton was really doing and Keynes's discovery about it. And the last bit is called A Modern Celestial Alchemy, which raises exactly your question. Gives a crash course in astrophysics. I used to be a physicist in a previous life, I think.
Vanessa.
Yeah, it was just quickly, I mean, just that comment, again, I've put it on the chat, but obviously your book, Jo, is linked to a podcast series on the history of alchemy, put on run by Travis, and I suppose it's really striking. East Midlands Salon links to the Lunar Society, to Derby, the Enlightenment. It's outside the university, and so it was just a comment on how we all know the crisis of the pursuit of knowledge at universities. But I suppose it's really, really striking how so many podcasts are out there that want big universal histories, and they make they'll take a particular aspect of that, whether it's a history of literature or it's a history of warfare, or in this case a history of alchemy, and that actually so many people are enthusiasts about there. There's a real renaissance of autodidacts around podcasts, whether it's people putting on podcasts or it's the podcast audience. And so just a comment on that.
Thanks. Richard, last person before we go to final comments.
Thank you very much. I thought I needed to follow up on Jonathan's point, who waved that splendid book around, which I will certainly get. And he reminded us of Keynes, who obviously brought to light Newton's great interest in alchemy, i.e. Newton's interest in the pursuit of knowledge to court, really, and the rather cheap trivializing him as some kind of clockmaker or somebody who put in that model universe. And, all I can do, and I recommend colleagues follow Keynes' advice. I mean, Keynes once famously said, "God has arrived. I met him on the 5:15 train." And I do think God has got an answer to the question Jonathan posed us, which I have referred you to in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Jo, final comments.
On the what is today's alchemy, I'm sure there are some specific things going on in the way that Alan alluded to around uncharted waters in areas of chemistry, for example. And I think that's where our space for our imagination, which is that point that Hannah Arendt makes. And this is where I think our challenge for those people who have got some problems with the limitations that environmentalism puts on us is that rather than thinking within limiting what we currently do, is trying to think much more imaginatively about, are there totally different ways that we can engage with and use the resources that are available to us and do new extraordinary things. And I suppose that would be for me the other aspect of the book that I suppose I found quite useful, going back to people like Erasmus or other times when people, or Aristotle, or whoever, who some ways imagine there was a limit to our knowledge. And I suppose what we're faced with today is a new way that we're faced with limits. And I think for us, it's about trying to say, it's not the orthodoxy and posed by a church, but there is nevertheless an overbearing sense of limits that is imposed by a wholly different set of problems. But it doesn't mean to say that they're still not limits. They're still limits. And I think we have to think about, how do we as a society deal with that way that the world is presented to us, and do we want to live within that constraint? And I think that's going to be a very difficult challenge for us. And the more ideas, in the way that you've suggested, Alan, that people think about resources and not accepting that we can only use them in the way that we currently do, is is probably going to be one of the things that we need to do. And in that sense, you could say there is alchemy continually presented to us. But another side of it, and I don't know, and this is the discussion, I suppose, that maybe, well, I certainly need to think about more, and I suppose Jonathan's alluded to it and other people have discussed it, is there a problem in the way and the modern scientific era is presented in terms of this these various different divisions and compartmentalization that was inherent within the scientific revolution? As I said, I think what the initial 100, 150, 200 years allowed us to do in terms of moving forward was underpinned by a sort of prior acceptance that overall we were still moving towards a common good. And I think the problem is that we don't have that has moved beyond. That's not just the problem of secularism, it's the fact that we don't have a sense of common cause. And I think that in one sense has meant that the dynamism that propelled the scientific revolution forward, because it was based on self-evident truths. We don't have self-evident truths. And I think in one sense, for me, therefore, the problem seems to be, how do we go back and just reconsider some of the science and the scientific approach to see how we overcome that disconnection between ourselves in the world and the physical world that science is dealing with, because there seems to be a real disjuncture. But then, so that's on some of the more fundamental things about scientific revolution, which of course is a major thing to go to rethink. But is there a problem with science as we now conceive it? But then specifically, I'm fairly sure there are people who are doing work like the two people that I've mentioned already, which is William R. Newman and Lawrence Principe, who are also going back to original alchemists and actually looking at their scientific method and what were they looking at. But I have made a note for myself already that I want to keep a bit of an eye and go and have a look at what Principe is doing, because he's an active science currently producing a book, and I'd be quite interested to know and track him and find out what he's publishing, where he's taking his ideas. So I think there's lots to explore, but I think it's a very difficult subject, and I can do it. We can look at it. I can look at it superficially, but other people. And I think it's almost like it needs that sort of multidisciplinary, expert, non-expert type of discussion to sort of take it forward. And I do think maybe some of the discussion about environmentalism might be some of the way to bring some of those discussions to a head.
Thanks, Jo. I think as that last point, or Ruth's point about who are the alchemists today, and the discussion that followed it on, and Vanessa mentioning that salons were part of a different tradition outside the university. So reinvigorating that spirit of the alchemists, the search for knowledge, is really important to us. What I'm going to do now is unmute you all so you can give Jo a clap if you can. There we go. Thank you, Jo.
Thank you.
And then